A strange thing happens when people talk about English. Everyone agrees it is a global language, spoken by millions in different ways, accents, and styles. Yet somehow, some speakers believe their way is the only correct one. That belief has created many awkward moments around the world, but none as unexpected as the story you're about to hear. Because this time, someone tried to shame a Filipino for speaking English, only to discover something in his own work that completely turned the tables. Imagine this: a Filipino student, confident and proud, speaks English during a classroom discussion in an American university. Her accent is warm, shaped by years of Philippine education, where English is part of daily life. She answers a question clearly, her points organized, her tone respectful. But instead of focusing on the ideas she shared, the professor pauses, stares, and says something that would soon come back to haunt him. He says, "Your English is interesting, but you should work on sounding more correct." The room goes silent. A few students shift in their seats. Some look down. Others glance at the professor, unsure if they heard him right. The Filipino student, surprised but composed, simply nods and says, "Thank you, Professor." She doesn't argue. She doesn't defend herself. But deep inside, the words sting. Not because she felt her English was imperfect, but because she knew what he said came from a place of superiority, not guidance. The professor, a well-known linguist who spent years teaching about language evolution, probably thought the conversation would end right there. But life can be ironic, and sometimes the truth hides in the very places we least expect. Later that evening, the Filipino student shares the story with friends. They're angry, even more than she is. They tell her, "You should speak up. Your English isn't only correct, it's one of the most globally understood accents." But she doesn't want to start a fight. She wants facts, not drama. So she decides to learn more about accents, world Englishes, and language diversity. What she discovers shocks her. Because the person who had criticized her, the same professor who told her to sound more correct, had written a book years earlier. And in that book, he explained how English has no single owner, how accents evolve, how Filipino English is one of the world's most stable and effective forms of English, because Filipinos grow up learning grammar from textbooks, pronunciation from mixed sources, and vocabulary from global culture. Yes, in his own book, the professor wrote that Filipino English is structurally consistent, highly intelligible, and a strong example of a localized world English. He even praised it for its clarity and influence across Asia. The student blinked, stunned. How could the same man who praised Filipino English in writing shame her for speaking it? She read the chapter again, just to be sure, and the more she read, the clearer it became. The professor wasn't correcting her English. He was exposing his own bias, a bias his own research contradicted. The irony was almost unbelievable. The next day in class, she didn't plan to embarrass him. She only planned to ask a simple question. When the moment felt right, she raised her hand and said, "Professor, I read your book last night, the chapter on world Englishes. You said Filipino English is one of the most understandable English varieties in the world because it is logical and consistent. Can you explain what you meant by that?" This time, the room didn't go silent. It buzzed. Students leaned forward. Some even smirked. They knew exactly what she was referring to. The professor froze. He recognized the quote instantly, his own words, his own research, and suddenly, he realized he had underestimated the very speaker whose language he once praised academically. The pause felt longer than it was. Finally, he cleared his throat and tried to answer. "Well, I did say that. Filipino English does have strengths. It's just that some accents may need polishing." But before he finished, another student spoke. "But didn't you also write that accents shouldn't be judged by how American or British they sound, but by how clearly the message is delivered?" The professor looked cornered, not by aggression, but by facts. Facts he himself had published. Another student added, "Her message yesterday was clear. We understood her completely." The Filipino student didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited for his reply. And eventually, after a long silence, the professor sighed and said words she didn't expect. "You're right. I shouldn't have said that yesterday. That was insensitive. Your English is excellent. Thank you for bringing this up." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But the moment was powerful because something rare happened in that classroom. Someone confronted bias without anger, and the truth spoke louder than pride. But the story didn't end there. In fact, what happened afterward was even more eye-opening. Students began discussing accents openly. Some shared experiences where people mocked their Spanish, Indian, or African English. Others admitted they used to think American or British English were the real standards until they learned about world Englishes. The Filipino student found herself at the center of the discussion, not as a victim, but as someone whose courage sparked an entire room to rethink language. Days later, the professor approached her privately. He apologized again, and then, in a surprising twist, he asked if she would help him update a new chapter he was writing, one on accent bias in academic environments. He said her perspective was something he needed, something students needed, something he wished he had understood earlier. The woman agreed, not to prove him wrong, but to help create a better environment for others. And from that collaboration came something unexpected, a deeper understanding between teacher and student. A bridge formed not through perfect English, but through honest communication. And here's the part of the story that many people love. When the professor gave a lecture months later, he quoted the Filipino student. He said, "Language is not a test of worth. An accent is only a map of where a person has been, not a limit on where they can go." The room applauded, and the Filipino student, sitting quietly in the back, felt a warm sense of pride. Now, pause for a moment and think about this. How many times have people judged someone's intelligence, confidence, or capability based only on an accent? How often has society ignored the truth that English is no longer controlled by one country, one race, or one group of people? Today, millions of Filipinos speak English in workplaces, schools, hospitals, industries, and global conversations. Their English connects families abroad, serves international companies, teaches young children, saves lives in call centers, and reaches audiences worldwide. Filipino English is not inferior. It is influential. So now let me ask you, if someone mocked your accent, what would you do? Would you stay silent, or would you use the truth to change the moment? Drop your answer in the comment section. I really want to know what you think. And before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps us tell more stories like this one. Because at the end of the day, what turned the tables wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was knowledge. The Filipino student didn't fight the professor's insult with insults. She fought it with his own research, with calmness, and with confidence in her identity. And that confidence changed not only the professor's mind, but the entire class. This story reminds us that the real power of language is not in how perfectly we sound, but in how honestly we communicate. And sometimes, the truth hiding in someone's own words is enough to transform a moment of shame into a moment of victory.